Okay, good morning and welcome back. Welcome back to our Voices of the Church series. Today we're going to look at the life and significant legacy of the last of those four great Latin doctors. The last of those four great Latin doctors is Pope St. Gregory the Great. And you know, when assessing the significance of someone in history, sometimes it just doesn't take too much detective work or analysis. You know, when you're trying to figure out if someone really made an impact, if they really left a footprint in history, sometimes it's just not difficult. One glaring indicator might be someone's official recognition as, quote, the Great. The Great. To have that modifier officially added to one's name in history is a rare thing. I'm not certain, I tried to find this, I'm not certain how many there are that historians officially recognize this way. It might not surprise you to know that historians don't always agree on everything. But it's somewhere around the number of 40-ish people throughout all of recorded history. And we have 6,000 years of recorded history. That's pretty impressive to have only 35 to 40 names that are recognized that way. There are only two, arguably three, popes who get this official designation. Pope St. Leo the Great, Pope St. Gregory the Great, and increasingly, by popular acclaim, Pope St. John Paul the Great. Pope Benedict XVI has publicly called for him to be known as the Great. So another indicator about someone's impact in history might be when they have given their name to an event, a movement, an era. In this case, consider the Gregorian Mission, Gregorian chant, Gregorian reform. Are you getting the picture? Pope St. Gregory the Great, as I said, is the fourth and final of those great Latin doctors. We've examined the lives and contributions of the other three. And remember, those first three, St. Ambrose, St. Jerome, and St. Augustine, were all contemporaries. They all lived at the same time. That's not true of this man. Gregory the Great was born a century after the death of St. Augustine. And he both anchors the end of a period. The classical age actually ended with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, you'll remember. And he marks the beginning of a new period, the medieval age. His papacy lasted only 14 years, but what a dynamic and fruitful time. He was born into a prominent patrician family of Rome, patricians being that closed class of Rome who are descended from the oldest families. They can usually date their lineage back to the founding of Rome in the 8th century BC. Some sources recount that his father was a Roman senator. Others disagree with that. He apparently had served in some sort of Roman service. They owned some impressive real estate in and around Rome, including atop one of the famous 7 hills of Rome. The Cælian Hill, they owned property, owned an estate on the top of that hill. They also held estates and villas throughout Italy, in Sicily. One gets the sense that theirs was more than just the typical patrician wealth. He came from a very wealthy family. And his great-great-grandfather, here's some trivia for you this morning, his great-great-grandfather had been Pope Felix III. Yes, process that for a moment. His great-great-grandfather had been Pope Felix III. You heard that correctly. A pope had grandchildren. Unless you think that this is an episode of the bad popes, again, I should probably qualify that and tell you that Pope Felix III had been married and widowed before he became a priest, and obviously before he was elected pope. So this is not a rerun of the Borgia popes or anything. But Gregory, suffice it to say, I think from these two very distinct family impressions he would have had on him, being from this wealthy family of Rome, having also a lineage, a tradition of having served in the church. He was groomed, really, for a secular career. His parents had hoped this for him. He was well educated, especially in the field of law. and he served briefly as Roman prefect. And so you know what prefect is. Prefect, to say that it's the mayor of Rome doesn't really go far enough. The prefect is one of the oldest and most influential offices in ancient Rome. And it held great prestige. In royal Rome, when Rome was ruled by kings, in the Roman Republic, when Rome was ruled by a consul, and when in imperial Rome, when they're ruled by an emperor, this office, the prefect, is one of the constants. It's always there, and it held great prestige. These were the men that were responsible for the governance of the city of Rome itself. But his biographers agree that this particular career path never seemed to set well with Gregory, and that he felt a call to the religious life, particularly drawn to monasticism at a very young age. He did not enter that life, though, until the age of 34. As I said, he served in this secular governance position for a while. Later in his life, he wrote of the ongoing conflict that he had between this calling to the religious life and the expectation that he would serve the Rome as prefect. He established a monastery after his parents died and his inheritance. He established a monastery on Syrian Hill, as well as several others on parcels of family estates that he inherited across Italy. And by 579, we find him, he was a deacon, and he was the papal legate to Constantinople, officially serving the Pope in that capacity, in that diplomatic capacity, to the imperial capital of Constantinople. And in 590, we find him Pope, suddenly, during a time of great plague in Rome. Probably, incidentally, bubonic plague, we think. It's a continuation of an outbreak that had happened earlier in that same century. Constantinople was hit particularly hard by plague in the early part of the 6th century. And during this time of plague, Gregory organized a procession in Rome, a Marian procession, and probably this was inspired by the time he had spent in Constantinople. Constantinople, just to sort of give you a little bit of piece about that. The reason I say he might have been exposed to that in Constantinople is because that city, from its very beginning, it was the old Greek city of Byzantium, but Constantine the Great renamed the city after himself, Constantinople, and it was dedicated under the patronage of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, as she's known primarily in the East, the Mother of God. And so he probably was exposed to this there, because in Constantinople there were frequent Marian processions in times of plague, in times of conflict, and so we think that that's probably where he was inspired first to do this. So a procession through the streets of Rome to end at the Basilica of St. Mary Major, imploring the assistance of the Blessed Mother against this plague. And what's fascinating about this story is that according to tradition, this procession that he organized, during this procession, he had a vision. As they approached the tomb of Hadrian, the Emperor Hadrian, on the Tiber River near Vatican Hill, you may know this place as the Castle San Angelo, the Castle of Angels. This was the tomb of the Emperor Hadrian. And as he approached that with the procession, he had a vision of a resplendent St. Michael drawing a sword at the top of that structure, and then seeing him sheath his sword. And looking at Gregory triumphantly, as if to say, this is won. This is already won. So, and incidentally, in the 18th century, if you've ever been there, you know, this beautiful bronze statue of St. Michael atop the Castle San Angelo was placed there to commemorate this specific event, this specific vision of Gregory. So the interesting thing, the capstone piece to that story, is that he related this vision to many, many people, contemporaries who later wrote about it. It's come down to us as tradition. But I do have to say that it was the end of the plague in Rome. It was the end of the plague in Rome. The plague was but one challenge, though, that he faced. It was a very trying transitional time in history. I think very few men would have been able to rise to the challenge as he did. But his influence over the next 14 years until his death in 604 is precisely why he is remembered as the Great. It is this 14-year period of his life that you see him responding to these incredible challenges. That's why people earn this designation of the Great. And I'm speaking now as a historian, not just as a church historian, but as a secular historian. This is the reason that history commemorates people, and only a few, only a handful, because they have to have lived during trying times. They have to have made significant contributions. And I think arguably, at the end of the day, one of the major considerations for us is it the man who made the times? Is it the man who responded to the times? And usually that's the case. You see the work of this individual in this 14-year period making a significant difference. It's also, I think, the reason why he was so rapidly acclaimed a saint upon his death by the Universal Church, almost immediately upon his death. One unusual secular challenge that he faced was a group known as the Lombards. Now, these are not to be confused with the people who occupy the region of Lombardy. The Lombards are a tribe, a Germanic tribe that originally came from Scandinavia, probably at the beginning of the 6th century, and migrated southward. They are among the people that Rome would have called barbarians. So he faces a significant challenge from these people who settle in northern and central Italy. And I think it's fair to say, I was thinking of a word to use to describe them besides barbarian. I have all sorts of historical issues with that word barbarian, but I was trying to think of a different word to use to describe them. And the word bully comes to mind. You know, they were bullies. They had bullied Pope Stephen the century before, the century into the future. They bullied him. Were sort of a constant thorn in the side as far into history as Charlemagne in the 8th century. So they had this reputation of being, I think bullies is a fair word. Anyway, as Pope, Gregory was always having to deal with them. Always. He twice saved Rome from being sacked by the Lombards. Through negotiation, yes, but probably through some coin from the papal treasury as well. We don't know that he bought them off, but you can assume that that might have been a factor. He was known to give very generously, even of his own funds, to help, for instance, refugees, people that had been kidnapped by the Lombards, who had been held as ransom. He was very quick to give his personal money to just about any cause for people that he saw who needed something in and around the city of Rome. So this is a great perspective. You know, when we think about him twice having stopped the Lombards from sacking the city of Rome, I think it's a great perspective that these early medieval popes were navigating a pretty complex environment when you think about it. I mean, imagine going home and turning on the news today and hearing this about Pope Francis, right? We wouldn't. We wouldn't, because there is such a clear separation of the function of the church and the function of the state that we wouldn't have this conversation today. So I think it's a great perspective to keep, that these medieval popes navigating these very complex waters were having to figure out how to simultaneously be the spiritual head of Christendom, all of Christianity, but also someone who would carry enough authority in the secular realm to be a king, for lack of a better term, in many ways. This is actually quite reminiscent of Pope Leo I, by the way, the other great pope of history. Did y'all know that it's Pope Leo the Great who stopped Attila the Hun from sacking the city of Rome? In the year 452, Attila the Hun had led an army to attack Rome, and Pope Leo met personally one-on-one with him. We don't know anything about that meeting. We don't know what exactly was said, what transpired in the meeting between the two men. But what we do know is at the end of the meeting, Attila and his army left. They left Rome untouched. So this is, I think, again, very important for us to have this perspective that these medieval popes had quite the task, I think it's fair to say. In both cases, with Pope Leo and Pope Gregory, it was their direct intervention that saved the city. Pope Gregory was eventually able to forge a peace with the Lombards and their king, which again is quite an achievement, knowing what we know historically about the aggression of those people. As Pope, his other secular accomplishments included repairing a lot of the decaying infrastructure in the city of Rome, repairing and building new roads, repair of aqueducts for the water supply, for instance, very practical things that he seems to have paid for out of his own funds. Paid for the equivalent of what we today would call police and fire protection in the city of Rome. He established that, or re-established it, I should say. The Emperor Augustus had originally established a police and fire division, but it is Pope St. Gregory the Great who re-establishes that as professional service in the city of Rome. Another challenge he faced was the growing tensions between Rome and Constantinople, between Eastern and Western Christianity. In the late 6th century, the Pope, as Bishop of Rome, and the successor to St. Peter, first among the apostles, was first among the bishops. But we don't have any evidence that Pope Gregory the Great understood that to mean that he had absolute power over all bishops. As a matter of fact, he seems to have functioned in a way, his understanding was that he was first among equals. But obviously, since the beginning of the great councils that started in the 4th century, there was this expectation that anything decided by a council would be sent to the Pope for him to ratify or approve, or to put his seal on, if you will. So there is that understanding of the papacy. He understood that as the successor to St. Peter, he had inherited an obligation on issues of faith and morals, and to hold other bishops to account on those issues. So here's what's going on. The bishopric, the patriarchate, if you will, of Constantinople did not exist until 330, the year 330, when the Emperor Constantine created that city. The old Greek city of Byzantium was really just kind of like a fishing village there on the straits going into the Black Sea. And once it was created as a second capital of the empire, then you can naturally understand how there would be almost a rivalry between these two places. The first capital of the empire and the second capital of the empire. And then there began to be a dispute over the desire of the bishop, the patriarch of Constantinople, to begin using the title, quote, ecumenical patriarch, which is, of course, a title still used today. The current ecumenical patriarch is Bartholomew I. You may have followed in the news some of the conversations that are ongoing between he and Pope Francis. So this is a tradition that began going back at least as far as Gregory's papacy. So the ecumenical patriarch wanted to be recognized as primus inter pares, the first among equals, and the spiritual representative of all Christians in that part of the empire. So in the 6th century, Pope Gregory, with charity, balked at this. And the fact that there was disagreement about this particular issue in the 6th century underscores how early the division between Eastern and Western Christianity began. The escalating tensions that are going to come about, you can almost trace to this point. You see, Pope Gregory believed that the title undermined Rome's primacy as the See of St. Peter. He was concerned about the language. He worked very diligently to keep the peace between he and the ecumenical patriarch. But unfortunately, of course, this relationship continued to deteriorate over the next several centuries, culminating, of course, in the year 1054, when the papal legate walked into the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople and laid down a writ of excommunication for the patriarch. And that, as they say, is history, because we've been divided ever since. So this is really, I think, the beginning of that. It has its roots in empire, in the creation of the city of Constantinople. For instance, if you looked at the First Council of Nicaea in 325, the council lists the great cities. It lists them in order, the apostolic sees, as Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, which Jerusalem didn't really exist as a see anymore, but it always held a place of honor among those four great apostolic sees. And they're listed in the canons of the council that way, in that order: Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. So that's in 325. If you looked at the record of the next council, which is held in 381, just 56 years later, the First Council of Constantinople does something really interesting. They decreed, quote, "The Bishop of Constantinople shall have the prerogative of honor after the Bishop of Rome, because Constantinople is the new Rome." And the listing of sees becomes Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Now there are 5. Do you see? See what just happened? And so naturally, on the part of Rome, there is some concern about this. And really, the concern is more that the position of Alexandria has been supplanted, not so much the creation of, quote, the new Rome. Certainly by this time, everyone knew, by the late 4th century, everybody knew that Rome was passing away and that the Western Roman Empire would soon be gone. So I think it was quite right to look to the East for that center of authority. The troubling thing was the elevation of that see to replace, or really take the place of, second place of Alexandria by tradition. So, my point is that this became a point of contention also between East and West, between Pope and Ecumenical Patriarch. And the term itself, Ecumenical Patriarch, Pope Gregory seems to have taken some issue with. And remember, if you don't know this already, Pope Gregory is the first to use the title to describe himself, and it's adopted by most future popes. But he's the first to use the title Servant of the Servants of God. And actually lived a pretty monastic lifestyle with great humility. And so he may have been troubled by that as well. He continued actually to live as a monk even while he was Pope. It was Pope St. Gregory the Great who initiated the first recorded mission that went out from Rome into the pagan heathen world. The first such mission. The Gregorian Mission, led by a monk, St. Augustine of Canterbury, in 597 to England. The traditional story holds that Pope Gregory was moved by the sight of the beauty of Angle slaves that he saw in the market at Rome. Now, this is a traditional story that's told in his first biography, an anonymous one, and then it's picked up again in future centuries. You might remember we've talked in here before about the Golden Legend, and so the story appears there. It appears in St. Bede's history, which is very good. It's a good source. But that he was moved by the sight of the beauty of the Angle slaves at a market in Rome, thinking them very noble and beautiful creatures. He was inspired to send a mission to England to convert them to Christianity. And again, this comes from the anonymous life of Gregory that was published shortly after his death. And according to that account, when Gregory saw them and he inquired in the market of the identity of the slaves, and he was told they were Angles from Britannia, which is how the islands were still known, that they were Angles, he replied that they were not Angles, but angels. And he sent Augustine, the abbot of Gregory's own monastery, actually, in Rome, on Celian Hill, along with 40 other monks, on a mission to convert these noble people of England. So the background is that while Britannia, as Rome called it, had been under Roman rule, had been under direct Roman rule since the 1st century BC, really, it was the first part of the empire, think about it, if you look at it geographically, it was the furthest northern part of the empire, and so it was the first to suffer decay and decline. That's where Rome called all the legions home from first. And Rome did that beginning in the year 410, calling all the legions out of Britannia. And of course, we talked about this before, when the legions went, so did the Roman officials. And Britannia, people of Britannia, wake up and find themselves with no governance. There's no structure. And of course, there are people who will take advantage of that. The Angles and the Saxons, Germanic peoples from Central Europe, began to migrate into England beginning in the 6th century, taking advantage of this void of authority there. And the Angles and the Saxons, Germanic pagan peoples, had blended with a apparently very lively, dynamic, thriving Christianity that had been going on in pockets throughout England. We have some records of some great early Celtic saints, for instance. We know that Christianity reached what is today England, reached England very early, by the end of the 1st century. And we assume that happened through Roman contact. So it's not like there was no Christianity in England. What had happened in the intervening years was the coming of the Angles and the Saxons and the blending of that with that early Christianity there, and it didn't really look the same. It would have been unrecognizable to someone on the continent of Europe. So it's a beautiful story, actually, and one that I wish we had far more time for. It's a story that is related in great detail by St. Bede in his Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Because the Gregorian mission to England accomplished the creation of the great See of Canterbury, which is still the see of primacy in England today, although it is Anglican today, for the Anglican Church today. But it was the great seat of archbishops who wielded considerable influence, not just in Britain, but in European affairs. Wielded considerable influence, including, think about some of the greats. St. Dunstan, St. Anselm of Canterbury. It produced some significant figures of history. So the mission, actually, as it happened, converted the King of Kent. And I just want to show you, I don't know if you can see this real clearly here, but Kent being down here, there's really only about 16 miles that separates, that water separates Calais, the port city, from Dover. It's about 16 miles. You know, but it might as well have been from here to the moon in the 6th century. This was quite a trek. And what this meant is that the whole island had become rather isolated anyway from the continent because of this just mere small little geographic separation made such a difference in isolating them. Well, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, what you see is there are really 5 kingdoms that are established by the time we're talking about. You have the kingdom of Wessex, you have the kingdom of Kent, you have the kingdom of Mercia, Anglia, and Northumbria. And all of them are ruled by separate kings, okay? So what this Gregorian mission does, by sending these missionaries into Kent and converting the king of Kent, and therefore all the people of Kent converted, it actually begins to bring about the consolidation of those kingdoms, the consolidation of England. This is a huge factor in that. So, as I said, the mission converted the king of Kent, who was already married to a Christian princess, so that didn't hurt, right? That didn't hurt. She was actually the daughter of one of the kings of the Franks, will become the dynasty of the first French kings. And therefore, all of his subjects converted, and it brought the existing surviving Christianity then more closely in line with Rome. I mean, it's just so much here we could talk about if there were time. There is some disagreement as to whether the king of Kent, whether it was the king of Kent who initiated the mission at his wife's urging. Now, this is an increasingly common story I'm hearing. The revisionist historians are saying, no, it wasn't really Pope Gregory's idea. It was King Ethelbert was his name of Kent. It was his idea, his wife's urging, to invite Pope Gregory to send a mission. But most historians hold to the view that it was in fact Pope Gregory's idea, and actually all the early sources support that. So Ethelbert, the pagan king of Kent, agreed. This is a great story. He agreed to meet Augustine, this monk. He agreed to meet him, but only if Augustine would agree to meet him under the oldest oak in the forest. Isn't this great? Because you see, in pagan religions, pagan lore, the oak is sacred. The oak represents wisdom. It's the oldest, biggest tree in the forest. It is sacred to these pagan earthbound traditions. And so Augustine could have easily said no. But he agreed. And they met under this huge oak tree and talked about universal truths. And the king allowed St. Augustine of Canterbury to preach at Little St. Martin's Church in Canterbury, which still stands there today, where, according to tradition, the king was baptized in the font that still stands there today in that ancient church, which is really quite a sight to behold. So this laid the foundation for Christian renewal of the British Isles. Separated, I said, by 15 or 16 miles of water at the narrowest point, it was nevertheless isolated, and the mission that Gregory undertook here, in the creation of the See of Canterbury, is so significant in the history of the faith and in the history of Europe and the world. It really is a remarkable story. And there's a little bit more to this northern connection. I was thinking about this past week, really, and thinking about, many of you know that we have our 5 priests here who are in, hopefully, dear Lord, will be servants of God soon. And one of them in particular, Father Francois Levassouet, was from a small town in Brittany called Gregory, which is under the patronage of St. Columba, which is interesting. And it struck me as interesting when I was there because St. Columba is, of course, a great Irish saint. St. Columba was from Ireland and established missions to the Scots and the Picts in the northern British Isles. And so what's interesting about this connection is that there is a connection between Pope St. Gregory and St. Columba. They were contemporaries. St. Columba died in 597. And so they also apparently enjoyed quite a robust relationship, this great Pope and this great saint of Ireland, who's actually, as I said, evangelized the saints, the Scots and the Picts. And actually right here, you can see tiny little island of Iona, right off the coast of Scotland. That's where he established a monastery, and it's today known, of course, as one of the Holy Islands. There are 5 letters that actually survive that not only attest to their correspondence, but to their friendship. And I think it was one of the mutual encouragement in the missions. So it tells me that Pope Gregory had taken an interest in, a very expansive interest in missions, in looking beyond into those old areas of the Roman Empire that had perhaps now Ireland had never been under Roman control. Hibernia, the island, had never been, but produced, of course, obviously some great saints of this period. His other work is timeless as well. Pope Gregory undertook many liturgical reforms. We talked about Gregorian Mission. Now we can look at Gregorian reforms. Related to the order of the Mass, there are changes that are kept to this day. He was the author of many collects that are still used in the church today. And while we know that, that singing and music have been part of Christian liturgy since the very beginning, since the earliest days of the church, he is known, of course, for providing a plain chant that became known to us as Gregorian chant. It is monophonic, unaccompanied, the beauty of the unadorned human voice. And it is a beautiful tradition in our church. It's still a great gift to the church today. Now, there is also an incredible miracle story to tell about Pope St. Gregory the Great that I would be remiss to not cover because it is absolutely fascinating. We've talked in here, I know, before about the Christian practice of the veneration of saints, the veneration of relics. We talked about the fierce defenders of that practice, the veneration of relics. Remember that in this period of the great Latin doctors, that was an issue. And we talked, of course, about St. Jerome and St. Augustine, who both vigorously defended that practice. So here we have a miracle story involving the same issue in our final great Latin doctor. In something known as the miracle of the Corporal, and there's a couple of variations of this story, okay? A couple of different ways that this story is told. I'll one of them is highlighted in this artwork, this 15th century artwork. And the other is a little bit different variation. But in 595, the Byzantine Emperor Constans asked the Pope, through his representative in Rome, asked the Pope for an authentic relic that he could display in his private chapel in Constantinople, and wanted this gift from the Pope. So the Pope Pope Gregory, gave to the imperial ambassador a cloth, purported to be a linen cloth, that had once wrapped the bones of several of the early martyrs of the church. And the imperial ambassador was, if you can imagine this, insulted by this. I guess hoping that he was going to take, what, the head of St. Peter back to Constantinople? I mean, I don't know why, but he was apparently insulted by this, wanting something more visually impressive, I suppose. And he had some very derogatory comments for the Pope, who was at the moment, actually, preparing to celebrate Mass. So it is said that the Pope used the linen cloth that he had intended to offer as a gift, that he used it as the corporal on the altar that day. And at the end of the Mass, the cloth bled, openly bled. This miracle was edifying in many ways, of course, immediately edifying for the benefit of the imperial ambassador, who must have felt pretty awful after that, as well as a miracle attributed already to Pope St. Gregory the Great in his lifetime, and later, obviously, whenever the medieval cult of relics or the veneration of relics was challenged, this particular miracle, which of course spread like wildfire in the church, which happened in the presence of many witnesses, I might add, this particular miracle was always cited now, whenever the veneration of relics was under attack. So that's one version of the story, is what you see is that at the end of Mass that the corporal bled. Now this art depiction actually shows another version of the story, which is that Pope Gregory held the corporal up and took a knife to cut it, to show the imperial ambassador that it would bleed. So there's two slightly different versions of the same story, but a great one nonetheless. Isn't that a great story? It's a great story. So his writings, I think I mentioned in my email that he was prolific. It is remarkable, really, that he was also the first pope to assure the survival of his writings, to assure the survival of his own personal library. and his papers, probably owing somewhat to his monastic inclinations. They had that sense of history, they had that sense of the record, the sense of keeping the record, keeping the texts. In fact, I mean, speaking as a historian, I can say that it's sad, but it's true that he is the only pope of the Middle Ages. We would say he's the first medieval pope, I think, but he's the only pope of the Middle Ages until the time really of the 12th century to have left a substantial body of work, to have a substantial body of work that has survived. We have a hole in the record from this early 7th century into about the 12th century. We have bits and pieces here and there, but he left a huge depository of his work. He wrote many homilies, of course, as well as commentaries on Scripture. His commentary on Job is quite noteworthy, I'm told. I've never read it, but I've been told that it is. He wrote a life of Saint Benedict, as his interest in monasticism, his interest in history. His interest in history is also proven in something called the Dialogues, which is where he recounts, sort of gathers together all of the miracle stories from across the Italian peninsula that he's aware of and puts them together into one source. Copies of over 800 of his letters. Think about that. 14 years as Pope. 800 letters have survived and are kept today in the Vatican archives. So, to the work, though, that I included in the reader, because it's a little bit different. And this is a homily that Pope St. Gregory the Great gave in the year 592. It was preached in Rome at the Basilica of San Clemente, homily 33, as it is known. It's also sometimes called the Sinful Woman homily, and it's because this is the homily in which he conflates the unidentified woman caught in adultery as Saint Mary Magdalene. He also identifies her as the sinful woman, quote, sinful woman, who anointed Jesus in the home of the Pharisee. So he conflates those two biblical narratives with St. Mary Magdalene. Unfortunately, this is a conflation error that stuck for centuries, and it was perpetuated really across the centuries. St. Mary Magdalene, the first person to see the resurrected Jesus, the apostle to the apostles, as St. Thomas Aquinas first called her. Across history, we never let the facts get in the way of a good story, though, do we? We as people don't do that. We don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. So she is often depicted as a prostitute, even to this day. Although I'm not sure how adultery and sex for hire are related exactly, but how that conflation would have even happened. But I digress. The origin of this, of that myth, are right here. And I'm going to speak to what I think his motivations were, which were good. I'm certainly not being critical of the message of this homily by any means. It's also the other reason I chose it is because it's a powerful pastoral homily about redemption. Redemption for the worst of us. But it set the foundation for a historical and biblical interpretation of Mary Magdalene that has been difficult to shake. It's been difficult to shake. Some of you may remember that I gave a teaching on St. Mary Magdalene as part of the series we did on the Apostolic Age back in the spring, where I spoke about this. We talked a lot about this. Besides the mother of Jesus, she is mentioned more than any other woman in the New Testament. She's mentioned 12 times by name, 12 times in total, which is more often than many of the apostles, I might add. Right? Some of whom only get 1 or 2 mentions. So if she were the woman Luke was describing in his gospel as the one caught in adultery, for instance, why would the evangelist not name her? To protect her identity somehow? No. We know her as the woman who had 7 demons cast out of her. We're told that. She's identified that way. She is named that way in the account in Luke and in Mark as the woman who had 7 demons cast out of her. So, this is how Pope St. Gregory conflates those. He says, the one that Luke calls a sinner and that John names Mary, we believe that she is that Mary of whom the Lord had cast out 7 demons. Because he identifies her with St. Mary Magdalene. And what are these 7 demons, if not the universality of all vices? Mary had 7 demons in her because she was full of all vices. Now, to be fair, again, Pope St. Gregory the Great is speaking personally, a personal interpretation of Scripture. It does not have the weight of infallibility. He meant this to be a homily on repentance. It is a homily that is quite pastoral, as I said, in its hope for redemption for the worst sinners. But because of this Pope, a noted doctor of the Church, by the way, obviously, interpreted this Scripture in a way to mean Mary Magdalene. She has been known that way ever since. There is no evidence, incidentally, among the early fathers that anyone else viewed Mary Magdalene in this way. As a matter of fact, let's look at what my friend St. Jerome said. Remember that he was influenced by strong women, particularly probably St. Paula, but I love what he had to say about St. Mary Magdalene. Now, he's writing a century before, actually, more than a century and a half before. Those unbelievers who read me may perhaps smile to find me lingering over the praises of weak women. But if they recall how holy women attended our Lord and Savior and ministered to him of their own substance, and how the 3 Marys stood before the cross, and particularly how Mary of Magdala, called of the Tower because of her earnestness and ardent faith, was privileged to see the risen Christ even before the apostles, they will convict themselves of pride rather than me of folly, who judge virtue not by the sex, but by the mind and the heart. Okay? So that's how St. Jerome had written about Mary Magdalene. And interestingly, the Eastern Orthodox Church, I find this tradition kind of beautiful too. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it is that she was always a holy woman. And that the 7 demons tortured her for being holy. That's the Eastern tradition. And that Jesus cast those demons out for her. So, but to conclude, I think the homily is actually quite representative, as I said, of his pastoral emphasis on redemption and the absolute limitlessness of God's grace. So more than any other figure in these first centuries, Pope St. Gregory the Great laid the foundation for a strong papacy, a strong church that's going to be a fortress against the world in the coming Middle Ages. He died in 604 and by all contemporary accounts was acclaimed a saint immediately by popular and universal assent across the church within just a very short time after his death. Writers referred to him, we find him being referred to as the Great by the next century, much the same way that is happening now, of course, with Pope St. John Paul II. We sort of see the same kind of groundswell of support for that as well. So, an important announcement is that next week we will meet on Thursday night. We meet this coming Thursday night, which is November the 5th. Is that correct? Yes. Thursday, November 5th, we'll meet in here at 6 o'clock. And the reason we're doing it on a Thursday night is because you're going to get a break from me. You're going to get to hear from Father Jason Foster, who is the pastor of Holy Nativity Orthodox Church here in Shreveport. And I call him Father Doctor. He's a PhD in theology and is going to give the presentation on the first of the great Greek doctors, St. Basil the Great. So he's a wonderful speaker. I think you'll really enjoy that. There's a lot to mine there. There's going to be some guests from his parish. So I do hope that you will join us. I know it's a Thursday night. You know that we can properly socially distance several more people in here. So it's a great ecumenical opportunity for us to get together. We don't have many opportunities to gather together with our Orthodox brothers and sisters. So I think that this is a great one, and I highly encourage you to be here for that. Okay? 6 o'clock. So until then, thank you very much.